Audio check. Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30. The inquiry is now resumed. Can everybody on the live stream, the Teams, hear me? I can see you, Mr. Fumicelli. Good morning.
Yes, sir. Well, good morning. Yes, sir.
Good to see you again.
And you?
Everybody hear me okay at the back? Good. All right. Just a few things then before we jump into this informal discussion this morning about the air quality and noise conditions. We've had an email from Mr. Kent from the Council about imminent response expected to be from a DFT.
Yes.
And a request to extend the deadline, which I think we are fairly agreeable to. It's just kind of how long do we need? And I guess we can't really answer that because we don't know what's going to be in the letter. But
that's true, but we were thinking perhaps to close the play Tuesday next week.
okay.
Not too far.
Yeah, well, we were thinking next Friday. But
Were you? Okay.
yes.
Fine.
So you've
Well, we'll take that too.
You've undersold that a little bit.
I mean, that might be, Tuesday might be quick, depending on how much we get.
Yes.
We also know that we're not going to get all of it, because they've indicated that some of our requests are being treated as FOI.
Oh, right.
And so we assume from that we're going to get a separate response on some of the matters we know not what, at some later date.
Oh, right. Okay. And the council will forward us a copy.
Anything
Yeah.
we will receive, we will provide to the inquiry immediately,
Okay.
to all parties. But if in terms of the timing, as you say, it's how long is a piece of string question really at the moment.
Okay. Next Friday, okay with your team, Mr. Humphries?
So yes, I think we're talking about the council's request to the DFT for information in relation to Jet Zero.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that correct? I don't think we're directly involved in the communication, so sorry if I'm just slightly out of the loop. It may be that things have been copied, but
Yeah,
I'm not
they
aware.
have, I'm afraid. We received a letter from the department yesterday indicating that they were going to provide a response today.
Right.
Of course, today's when we're supposed to be putting our supplementary evidence in. So,
Okay. So we're talking about the extension of time for any note that's going to be produced, obviously not just by the council, but by us, relating to Jet Zero. And if that was to be extended until, I think you suggested till next Friday, then we would be completely content with that.
Yeah, fine. Good.
thank you.
May I just check, because obviously it has an impact on it, the climate change proofs that are, I think, due today
Yes.
may obviously be affected by some of the contents of that.
So that as well. So we'll push.
That's what, I think that's the same thing.
So the deadline for those proofs, we'll push those back to next Friday as well.
Thank you.
That's what I assumed.
Yes.
Sorry, I may have misunderstood
Sorry if it wasn't
before.
clear.
That's what I
Yeah.
assumed was being said.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
We've received air quality and noise notes overnight. So we can just confirm they come from the appellant's team or?
Yes, I think it's the clarification that I requested.
Those two short things. I think one was the number of no changes that had gone into beneficial, and you'll have seen
That was it, yeah.
numbers. I won't comment on that. And I think the other point was the factual point about percentages that arose in some of the questions I was asking of Mr. Vaughan, I think. So when you finished your own points, there was one small point I wanted to raise, which doesn't relate to conditions.
Do you want to do it now or?
Certainly, sir. I just want to mention the point Mr. Smith yesterday, and I'm afraid he's not here, but he or his colleagues will be able to see this. Handed if you remember, a document, and I was handed it and I put it over there. And when you, I think, Ms. Searson asked me about it, I said I hadn't seen this. I thought that it was a representation from BANCC that I hadn't seen because I hadn't looked at it. When I, later in the day looked at what it was, I saw it was in fact the Womble Bond Dickinson letter of the 16th of March. Obviously I had seen that, so firstly I should just correct that As I say, the document was just handed to me and I just put it to one side. I didn't know what it was when I was asked the question. The second, and very briefly, so I would just say that I think Mr. Smith was putting this in some way to indicate a sort of equivalence with PCAA and BAN CC having submitted council's advice to members, draw attention to one or two rather obvious differences. Firstly, the Womble Bond Dickinson letter wasn't sent to members, it was sent to the head of planning, and it's obviously for the head of planning to draw it to whosever attention the head of planning seems appropriate. We at no point approached members on this. Secondly, as you'll see, it was a letter that followed the original decision and the, at that point, draft conditions, and it was, as you'll have seen from the letter, simply drawing attention to the conditions and what, I'm sorry, the reasons for refusal, not conditions, reason for refusal, and making submissions on those. So that's perfectly proper. There's nothing improper at all in that. We're simply making our representations known, and if Mr. Kent had wanted to circulate that to anyone else, that's entirely a matter for him. So I think there are some quite important differences, and we're not here arguing to reverse the council's decision. That clearly had been taken. We're simply making observations on the draft conditions in the light of the subsequent meeting, which was to consider the draft conditions. Statement of the blindingly obvious, but I do reject any parallel between what we very properly did and whatever PCAA and BAN-C did.
Okay. Right. Mr. Taylor, you've sent us a note this morning, slot note. Do we want to discuss this when we sort of get into the,
yes,
the kind of conditions side of it, or do we want to sort of...
You should have received from us yesterday evening, I think it was sent about 6:15, a table in which was prepared by, I believe, BAL, which had a column free for us to respond to their position, which we sent through. I hope you've received that. That had attached to it an additional note and two other documents that are referred to in the note relating to slot allocation and its implications for some of the conditions that we're going to discuss this morning.
Yes.
So, I'm just looking at my email.
Slot note I've got has been forwarded independently of anything else.
Yes, Mr. Kent, I believe, submitted
Yes.
the information to the programme officer yesterday evening at 6:15ish, that sort of time.
There's an email, 1823.
Right, there we are. I wasn't far out.
So is that, because we were sort of losing the plot a bit as to which version, because
Yes,
there's been that many. So is that the latest final sort of version?
That is the latest version from us.
Okay.
I don't believe BAL's produced a further version since then. So
Okay.
certainly I haven't seen one.
Joe forward that to us
1847.
last night.
Yeah. And then separate to that, there's a slot note, which I think supersedes the slot note in last night's
Yes, 'cause
email
we-
because of typos. Is
We
that
had some terrible typos because we produced it so quickly.
Okay.
So we've tried to correct those this morning.
Okay. Right. So I think
Mr. Humphreys, has your team seen these documents?
Yes, the note we circulated yesterday, which didn't have an extra column, or at least the version I've got didn't have an extra column, was where we thought the position was following, all meetings and correspondence. We too yesterday received, after 6 o'clock, the further fairly long version of this, which does change a number of things. Now, working late and working early, one can get on top of it, but it has arrived, I have to say, rather late. The short note council's opinion on the slot allocation rules, North Somerset Council's position on slots and Grampian conditions is a complete surprise. We didn't know about that, and we did wonder when we saw references to Grampian conditions what this was, and that hasn't been discussed. We were asked to produce a note just very basically, factually setting out the rules on slot allocation, and we had circulated that to the council for comment, as you particularly requested. We hadn't had any comments on that, and therefore we held off doing anything on that. I think it might have even been this morning we've received a fairly extensive mark up, and I think with a request, do we agree it? Well, I only saw it a little while ago, which doesn't mean that I don't agree it. It just means, I've literally only fairly recently been able to go through it, and I do express a little bit of disappointment in a context where I thought the idea was that we were trying to discuss things beforehand, try and resolve things, that we've now had a sort of series of things that we haven't seen before, haven't known about. It just makes today's session a little bit less worthwhile because I just haven't had a chance to go back and take proper instructions on things. And proper instructions on things aren't just speaking to people here. There are wider people within the airport organisation that need to be involved. But we are where we are, and there's no point over focusing on that. But as I say, a little bit disappointing, if I put it like that.
Anything you want to...
So yes, the position in relation to the slot note, you'll remember when that was asked for, I explained that we would attempt to agree it, and that it would also need to cover the relationship between slot allocation and conditions. I actually said that at the time. We received the note from BAL at around about 2 p.m. yesterday. So obviously we were here, all of us focused on the health evidence. We finished at 4 yesterday. Within 2 hours and 20 minutes, my team managed to respond to the conditions note, look at what the position actually was on slot allocation and send the note to you that you now have. We ran out of time to make the changes that we considered to be necessary to provide you with the information you needed in the slot note to be agreed with BAL, and we provided that this morning, having started work at 5:30. So we have done our best to deal with a note that we received at 2 p.m. yesterday, which we had thought would address the issue. We raised twice in cross-examination issues about slot allocation and coordination with both Mr. Brass and Mr. Williams, neither of whom were able to assist. Mr. Humphreys in re-examination suggested at some point that contract was somehow the solution. We had no explanation beyond that. We then understood, when the slot allocation note was mooted, I made it clear that we wanted that note to address this issue, and it didn't. So that took us by surprise yesterday, and we've addressed it as fast as we could in the circumstances. And if that causes difficulty today, then I'm sorry, but those are just the circumstances that have arisen.
Okay, well, this isn't the end of the process by any means. It is going to be, and it always was intended to be, a constantly evolving process, and this was intended to be useful to all the parties to sort of have this interim discussion on some of these tricky conditions.
Yeah.
Mr. Humphrey, I assume your team will want to comment in the fullness of time on that slot note. And
I think the slot coordination note, and it may be that there was a misunderstanding. We thought the slot coordination note, the one that's headed us, was supposed to be simply a very plain vanilla explanation for the inspectors, just to give you an idea of where the legislation was. It wasn't trying to address the relationship between that and planning conditions. We thought what was wanted, maybe we misunderstood this, was simply an explanation of what slot coordination was. And so that's what we did. As I said in relation to that note, it's not that I disagree with it, I just haven't read through it all to see if, I've read through it, but I haven't comprehended whether it's reflected all the provisions that would be relevant. The other note is a slightly, the one that's signed by council is a slightly different point. This introduces the concept of a pre-commencement condition. That in a sense is different in kind, and that's not something, as I understand it, that was discussed in the meeting on Thursday. And yeah, of course I can deal with it. All I was expressing was the view that it would be helpful if we could discuss these things beforehand.
yeah.
But there we are.
Okay.
We are where we are, and
Well,
we
we
have
are.
to get on.
And from our part, we've always tried to sort of encourage that dialogue between you, and we just reiterate that. I've only had 5-10 minutes to read through this, but it does have some quite significant implications, doesn't it? This, particularly, I'm looking at the second paragraph and the last paragraph. Effectively, what you're saying is you're going to need a new condition, a new pre-commencement condition.
Yes. I'm not sure it's all that significant, though, to be honest. The Grampian condition that we would need to seek would be one along these lines. I'm not suggesting this is final wording by any stretch, but it would need to see that, say, no development shall commence until Bristol Airport is designated as a fully coordinated airport. Now, the information that we've provided you with includes a report by the CEO of Bristol Airport Limited, Mr. Lees, to the Bristol Airport Consultative Committee, and in that report he refers to the slot allocation application that they made and withdrew in I think around about March or April of this year. In that report he explains why the application was made and why it was necessary in order to be able to comply with environmental controls. He also explains that they will be making a further application as soon as the airport returns to 2019 levels. And so he has made it perfectly clear that that application is going to be made. And you'll remember I asked Mr. Brass when we would return to 2019 levels, and he said 2024, 2025. So there's no difficulty. It's a process they're going to do anyway.
I don't disagree with you in anything that you've said, but the issue we're going to have to address is, well, we haven't seen any draft wording of it, but we'd want to see that, and then we would need to satisfy ourselves that meets the relevant tests.
Yes.
And this is already ringing alarm bells with me, because the airport wouldn't have any control over that process. This is effectively, if I can draw an analogy, it's like having a condition that required the developer to lower speed limit.
Yeah.
And those are constantly thrown out because that's a separate statutory process of which the developer has no control over that. So that's why I think me and my colleagues are a bit edgy at the moment about where this could go.
Well, we've looked at that point, and we've looked at the guidance in the MPPG, which I think is in paragraph 9 of the MPPG on the use of conditions. And that there's a specific paragraph in that which explains that you can impose conditions in a negative form where a further consent is required, as long as you're satisfied that there is, actually I'm getting this the wrong way around, you can't do it if you take the view that there is no prospect of the control in the grampian condition being met during the lifetime of the permission. So if you think that there is a prospect of the airport becoming coordinated in the lifetime of the permission, i.e. between 2022 and 2025, then you can impose that condition. Now, we're not suggesting at all that there is no prospect of coordination occurring in that period. Indeed, Mr. Brass explained that they would return to 2019 levels in 2024, 2025, and they would make their application accordingly. So that's the position in terms of the guidance. So we don't see it as causing any difficulties at all in that regard, and we're not suggesting there are any.
No.
But we are suggesting it's necessary.
But not necessarily within the appellant's gift to be able to comply with that condition.
Any more than any other grampian condition that requires the use of third-party land or which requires a further consent. And the guidance in that paragraph 9, addresses the point full square. So hopefully if you have a look at that, you'll be more reassured.
I think, so in a sense, we are talking about this condition now, and so maybe this is not unhelpful to have the discussion because it's not one in the schedule, and so maybe we should have a little bit of discussion about it now, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Of course. So, I'm well aware of what paragraph 9 says. I have it in my markup here. It's not quite as simple as that. There are obviously provisions in the Town and Country Planning Act about pre-commencement conditions. So section 100 ZA5 says in terms, planning permission for the development of land may not be granted subject to a pre-commencement condition without written consent of the applicant to the terms. And then obviously there are the regulations that go with that. You'll be very familiar with that. The difficulty with this is to become a fully coordinated airport, the airport has to be congested. If you look at the 1993 EU regulations, which do apply because they're regulations, not a directive, they're retained EU law, the airport has to be congested. Indeed, if it ceases to be a congested airport, if the problem goes away, then the coordination is removed under Article 3. And the problem with this is almost a catch-22 situation. When the airport applied before, and the council very helpfully sent that PowerPoint presentation which explained this, the airport was in a situation where it was expecting shortly to get to 9 million passengers against its cap, and it was expecting by this year, 2021, to get to 10 million. Therefore, it was about to become a congested airport. It's on that basis that it's able to apply for these powers, and obviously airlines and everybody else have to be consulted. The challenge we face is in a situation where the airport has planning permission to grow to 12 million, it may be said by airlines, well, you're simply not congested at less than 10 million, and we'd have to apply under this pre-commencement condition at less than 10 million. So say we're at 9 million again, and the airlines therefore may push back at this. Now, make it absolutely clear, the airport applied before for full coordination when it thought it was coming up against a hard limit. Therefore, it is not opposed to full coordination. That's what he was proposing to do. We haven't seen this, and we haven't seen wording of what is proposed, but something that was not a pre-commencement condition, but maybe either a condition or indeed an obligation that requires us to apply at a point, query how we define that, before we become congested, i.e. when we have a chance of success, would be something that we would be very willing to discuss, very open to. The point that's made in the advice about the contractual arrangements is really a very simple one, that when airlines operate from an airport, they operate under contractual arrangements. They don't just kind of turn up and start flying. There's obviously a contractual arrangement, and that allows the airport, under the contractual arrangement, they will say, look, we want to open a new route or a greater frequency, and the contract is updated or amended, or a new contract, which does give us some control before full coordination kicks in. Where slot allocation is important is that once the airport has been allowed contractually to operate the number of flights, the capacity, we can't really take that away from them. And that's where coordination comes in, because it allows, in a congested airport, the coordinator to make certain decisions or recommendations in relation to coordination. Now, our view, therefore, is that in the period before we are congested, we have our normal contractual arrangements as does any airport. When we begin to become congested, which is the point at which we're beginning, we're anticipating bumping up against environmental or other capacity limits, we would apply to be coordinated, and at that point we would have every prospect of being coordinated. Now, we would be, as I say, very happy to discuss something with the council, to give them the confidence that we're going to do something of this, as we indicated before, and come to what I would hope would be a sensible arrangement that is satisfactory for them and gives us the certainty that we can begin to implement our planning permission and apply for slot coordination when we have the best chance of achieving it.
Okay.
We're of course happy to continue discussions.
Yeah.
The reason for the Grampian style condition is because the airport is applying for a permission up to 12 mppa, where it intends to constrain itself by reference to the sorts of conditions we're about to discuss, and constrain the impact of the operations of 12 mppa by reference to those conditions. Our understanding is that those conditions are only going to be enforceable and indeed reasonable to impose on the airport if, when it becomes constrained, it has the ability through coordination to allocate slots via a coordinator. And so the difficulty that we face is that if at some future point they don't get coordination and they aren't coordinated, then the impacts that we're considering and you're considering, both benefits and disbenefits, will be different from those that have been assessed. Yeah. And so all we're trying to do is to ensure that the airport has the ability, via the coordination process, which it itself says it needs to get. Remember, we've given you quotes in the note that we've provided from Mr. Lees to the Consultative Committee, and indeed in the McDonald report, which I believe was part of the application that went to the Secretary of State, which says in terms that the application is made because it is the coordination process is, quote, the only mechanism available to constrain demand for flights at an airport through the slot process governed by EU regulation. That's what the Secretary of State was told. So we're taking that statement at face value, along with many other statements in that document. We've also looked at the law and presented that to you. We don't know yet whether or not there's another mechanism that we might be able to find, and we're happy to discuss it.
Yeah, good.
But we are going to need to be persuaded that in the event that we get to levels where constraint is occurring in a 12 MPPA airport, that the conditions that are imposed are indeed enforceable.
Yes, and indeed we're going to need to be persuaded.
I suspect that's right.
Just at the moment, there isn't a condition, is there, that the airport's operating under in terms of ATMs, air traffic movements?
There's no restriction on air traffic movements.
And what about quotas?
There is a condition that relates to quotas already.
Okay.
You've got a note which sets that out.
That's why, for the night period, we are a fully coordinated
Yes.
airport, because we would be congested.
Yeah.
There's a constraint that congests us, and of course then we're granted that, and we're level 3 coordinated, whereas during the day we're level 2 coordinated, which is a step down because we're not congested at those times.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right, shall we, I'm going to open up the, which I think is the right one, the list of table of conditions that we were sent yesterday evening then.
Thank you.
That's where the ball has stopped for the time being. Condition 15. That one first? Yeah, well, yeah. 15 first. We'll do that. That's the SEMP, isn't it?
Yes.
Mr. Morehouse, the PCAA got no comments on that one, so I'll bring you in. Just put your, it's a little bit less formal today, so if you want to speak, you don't necessarily have to.
Thank you.
Just find a gap and go for it.
Just as a general point with conditions, these are quite meaty, I would say. They're very detailed, lengthy. We're always under pressure from the Secretary of State to reduce numbers of conditions and reduce sort of the lengthiness of them. I think some comments we might make, it doesn't mean we don't think the stuff that they say isn't important, just does it need to be said in the condition? At the end of the day, the council have the powers to not accept something and discharge the condition. So
Yeah,
just
I think
as a
that-
kind
I
of
think-
broad approach that me and my colleagues
Yeah, just really
tend to
important.
take.
We're always looking for simplicity wherever we can, and I perhaps should have said at the beginning that for people listening in, or even people in the room that haven't been here before, this discussion today is completely without prejudice, so we are going to be talking quite openly and expressing opinions about conditions, but that does not prejudge any decision that me and my colleague come to subsequently. Just so on this one, you've seen some comments I made, and then that's been responded to overnight by the air quality witnesses, and that was
Yes.
I picked out one particular bit further down that which talked about putting restrictions on the type of heavy goods vehicles that would be able to access the site. I think the relevant bit is all heavy goods vehicles used in the construction programme should be compliant with Euro 6 emission standards, and all non-road mobile machinery should be compliant with stage 5 emissions controlled as specified in EU regulation 2016-1620. I don't have an intimate knowledge of those regulations, but assume they're still in force. Are they those? That was the first question. They've not been overtaken, or
I'm afraid sitting here right now I have no idea. I've not checked that, but I suspect we'll know in a few moments if we are given the opportunity.
I've seen.
Well, may I?
I've seen quite
Sorry,
a
may I?
few SEMP conditions in my time, and sure Miss Searson have. Can't recall ever sort of having the types of vehicles specified. I
think
I'm a little bit concerned with that as to how that, just thinking that through, how the legality of that, and and how that would work. And I guess we would say, isn't that a contractual issue between the airport and the contractor that undertakes the work? And that would be the appropriate way to deal with those matters. Is it a legitimate land use objective?
Well, I would say that it is, given that we're looking at the emissions from all sources in this inquiry, and indeed you've heard evidence about it. I think Mr. Pearce was trying to come in to tell us about the 2016 regulations. Is that right?
Yes, if I can just try to clarify the point that you were asking about. Basically, the Euro standards apply to the plant that is newly offered for sale on a given year. So what you find with the current fleet is that there will be some older ones which meet the older emission standards, such as stage 4 or even stage 3, whereas the newer plant will meet stage 5. So essentially the purpose of the text that NSE suggested was to ensure that the newest and cleanest is used out of the equipment that is potentially available.
Yeah, I understand that. It was just,
yeah.
Couldn't it not be dealt with through contractual contracts with the, you know, the developer, the builders?
It seems to me that if you want to take out something to reduce the length, then that would be the obvious candidate to remove. It does already include where reasonably available clause, which makes it a little weaker in effect.
Yeah, just, you know, if those vehicles are legally on the road, I'm just a bit concerned having a condition. I mean, where, you know,
I think the issue for
the logical extension of that maybe is that you say that all staff and contract workers don't drive diesel cars into the site. I'm just not sure why it's...
Well, I'm not sure of this, but I believe that there were certain assumptions made about the emissions from construction vehicles in the ES, and it may be that this reflects the assumptions in the ES.
Well, Mr. Pearce might be able to help us.
He might.
But I would. But we do know the fleet is over time is evolving. The commercial vehicle fleet, that is becoming cleaner over time. In any event, and that's perhaps, I don't know, the ES, would the ES have assessed a situation where specific controls were put on the types of vehicles?
No, the ES didn't assess the construction phase at all, other than the dust. That was scoped out, as was agreed with the council.
Yeah, but the ES, the air quality section of the ES will have just, it assumes that gradual improvement of a cleaner commercial fleet, doesn't it? Sort of going forward over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
For the operational activity, yes. The construction activity wasn't assessed.
No.
And that was scoped out on the grounds as being...
environmental statement as
It's not significant.
It's not significant.
Yeah. Okay. You know, what happens if somebody turns up in the wrong lorry, Mr. Taylor? They get turned round and...
As you can see from the end of the condition, there's a part that says that items A to K. Actually, that doesn't apply to that part, does it? I think it's something we need to look at further. We'll make a note of that and discuss it further between Dr. Brimfield and Mr. Pearce.
So I think this is one of those topics, the construction, where it's completely normal to have a construction environment management plan to control certain things, encourage certain things, but there's no suggestion that there's a significant environmental impact in relation to this. This is a temporary period. You know, we're talking about extending some buildings. This is similar to what would happen anywhere else in North Somerset when a building is controlled. And I'm not aware of requirements in any other planning permissions that say, you know, when you construct a building, you can only use a certain type of vehicle. That would be, I think, somewhat over prescriptive.
I believe similar controls to that were imposed on HS2, but
Yeah,
I
well,
would
that's
need
slightly different.
to dig things up. But there is obviously our submission that there's a requirement in policy terms to drive emissions down. This feeds into that process. But we're happy to discuss it. We're of the view that this is a matter that needs to be specified in the condition. But in any event, a KEMP has to be applied for, and we could require it at that stage as part of the process for getting it approved. So, because it does say the KEMP shall include, it doesn't preclude other matters being addressed.
Dr. Broomfield, do you want to? You've got your hand up, Dr. Broomfield.
Thank you. Yes, just to say, I mean, listen to all that you've said, and we will go away and think about whether this can be written in a less prescriptive or detailed form. The reason it was there, and you're right to say that this would be implemented through contractual arrangements between the airport and their contractor. That's quite right. From the council's point of view, this is the means by which the council seeks to ensure that process happens. Otherwise, obviously, we, as the council, wouldn't have any engagement in that contractual process. So that's the reason for having it here, to provide that level of control through the construction process. But having said that, as Mr. Taylor said, we'll go away and think if it can be done in a more simple, less detailed way.
Very good. All right. Well, perhaps something a bit less descriptive, and maybe something along the lines of best endeavours, and I'm sure between you can come up with some inspiring words. Is there anything else in 15 that's kind of people want to discuss? I think that was the only thing I had. Do you have anything else in that?
I mean, it's a fairly standard condition.
I'm looking at Bal's response and comments. I don't think there's anything in there, or there's some slight...
There's a tweak to the wording in the front part to clarify phase all. We had, I think, phase all until a KEMP for that phase development / element. Yeah. And what the wording from Bal is more precise, and we're content with it.
Okay.
All right. Anything else that's on the room on that one? No. Okay. Let's do I think the only other one, and then the air quality one, and we can relieve the air quality witnesses, I think, at that point, is the air quality action plan.
So this is section 106 in the existing commission, and now it's proposed to be a condition.
Wasn't, yeah.
That's right. It was in the draft section 106 before, I think.
Do you want to talk us through, so, again, because they're quite complicated and lengthy, do you want to someone talk us through the actual sort of purpose and function, what it needs to do, and then disagreements?
I think if it's acceptable, I'll ask Dr. Broomfield to do that, because he's much more familiar with it than I am.
Thank you. Yes, so the purpose of this condition, it derives from our case that we've discussed earlier this week, in that our view is that the airport should be delivering an improvement in air quality resulting from the proposed development. And so we designed this condition so as to ensure that the proposed development would indeed deliver an improvement in air quality. It's designed to be as non-prescriptive as possible within those parameters. So it provides in the table of emission limits that appears about halfway down the proposed condition. It provides for emission limits from the three main sources of emissions to air from the airport. And the numbers that go in this table would be those derived from the environmental statement addendum. And the first two items, the aircraft movement emissions and ground support equipment, were provided by Mr. Pearce to myself. And then the third component, the road traffic emissions, have not yet been provided because I understand that would take more work, but I understand also from Mr. Pearce that they could be provided if required. So that's designed to reproduce the impacts that are forecast for the without development scenario, thereby ensuring that the proposed development would make things no worse than would be the case without the development. So that was as proposed until a few days ago by North Somerset Council. Mr. Young, you asked us to go away and look again at that condition in the light of the comments made by the inspectors at the Stansted inquiry. So I've done that, and I've made two main changes to our condition, proposed condition as a result of that. The first is that the inspectors made clear that they were concerned about the prospect for tightening of that condition progressively going forward into the future, and that didn't give confidence and potentially took away from the validity of the permission. So I've taken out any provision for future changes to those limits. So there's no longer that sort of future revision element to it. So that was the first change. The second change is that is in the light of the comments or the discussions that we've had around the target of improving air quality over the past week. And so we've now provided two alternative versions. One is basically the original version, assuming that the airport is required to deliver an improvement in air quality. The second is a similar version, but it's designed to deliver to meet the air quality impacts that are forecast for the with development scenario. So that would reflect a situation where the airport is required just to meet the impacts that it says it will achieve for the with development scenario. So therefore, it's more or less the same, but the numbers in the table are slightly higher to reflect the 12 MPPA scenario, not the 10 MPPA scenario.
Is that the one that's in Appendix 1? Just to be clear. Or...
That is correct, yes. So Appendix 1 has two conditions in. Firstly, I think I should say condition 16, not condition 15, at the top. And then it should say Alternative A, which is the reflecting North Somerset Council's desired outcome. And then Alternative B, which reflects a situation where the airport achieves the impact set out in the environmental statement.
Mr. Humphreys, your team's concerns with this are around this whole concept of improvement as opposed to departing from what the ESs.
I think there are a number of things here, and in some senses it is quite instructive to look at the approach in the Stansted condition. And their equivalent of the action plan had to set out how the airport operator will take proportionate action to contribute to compliance with limit values for or national objectives, so the standards and the objectives that we discussed, through and then various measures. Quite a short, quite a straightforward condition, clear in its objective. I think there are a number of problems with this condition. Firstly, it starts within 6 months of the grant of this permission, rather than us obviously exceeding 10 MPPA, and so the equivalent of the Stansted condition, which is prior to the airport first handling 35 million, would be prior to the airport first handling 10 million in this case, and that may be more appropriate. I don't think we're opposed to the idea of within 6 months of grant, as long as it's absolutely clear that this is a condition that applies when we implement the development rather than now, because we already have permission. The condition then becomes, as I say, quite detailed in a number of ways, including these tables, maximum calculated emissions for aircraft movements. We're talking here, if I've understood the figures that are put in here, about, you know, an aircraft, if an aircraft is flying from here to Rome, it has a certain number of emissions. They're not local to North Somerset, and yet we're controlling those. Now, I may have misunderstood the figure, but that seems to be the case. And for road traffic emissions, again, we're talking about vehicles that, as part of the environmental statement, we've obviously had to calculate where they've come from and what type of vehicle they are, and work out what the total emissions are. But it's very difficult for us to in a sense, control or monitor that. So in terms, again, of reasonableness of a condition, that becomes extremely challenging, and the requirement to calculate, you know, future baseline emissions and how air quality impact will be determined and so on. It's very, very involved. The two alternatives seem to be equally problematic, and all of these versions of the condition are based around this concept that we have to improve air quality, and as you know, we don't accept that there is any legal or indeed policy requirement in all circumstances to improve, but one can see, I think it's in version 2 of the appendix version.
Is that alternative B?
I think it's alternative B. Again, let's not go into it, but obviously this is fairly new to me, as it is to everyone else. But that seems to say, if I've understood it correctly, the plan will set out the measures to be implemented to ensure the expansion of the airport under this permission results in air quality impacts no greater than those set out in the ES and the ESA. Now, firstly, obviously there are two sets of impacts in the ES, which is on one basis, and the ESA, which is it. But secondly, if one took it as being the ESA, well, there are 200 odd receptors. Does that mean that at every receptor we have to calculate the process contribution from the airport, which are fractions of a microgram and fractions of a percentage, and if at any one of those we exceed, that in some way we're not consistent with the action plan? That would seem extremely difficult, and it's not envisaged here that we're given any veto over the council's ability to grant permission for other developments which might push levels in any of those locations above the PEC that we have calculated. We've obviously looked at things. It just seems to me that that this is a condition that fails the test for a number of reasons. Firstly, is not necessary. There is no dispute between the parties that there is no significant effect here. Absolutely agreed. These are really negligible, and in a very few cases, slight things. Relevant to the development to be permitted, potentially at the moment the way it's worded seems to imply almost, I'm sure this could be clarified, that it would apply from the point that the plan is approved, and the development will not have started at that point. I'm not sure how enforceable it is. Does the council literally go out to every one of the 200 receptor dwellings, carry out monitoring and work out there's an exceedance? For that reason, it seems to me not precise. And for all of those reasons, the sheer lack of thought that's gone into it, it's just not reasonable. And compared with the Stansted form of contract, form of condition, which is much more about, look, there needs to be a plan that sets out what your measures are to try and improve air quality, that's a much more sensible, workable thing. And as part of that plan, we can talk about individual measures and monitoring and how we're going to do things. But that seems a far more appropriate approach.
So just so I'm clear, the airport, you're not objecting to the principle of such a condition?
Not at all objecting to the principle of an air quality action plan being submitted and approved, and it's setting out various measures. We did make clear that the air quality effects identified in the ES and the ESA don't include any of these measures. So this would all be stuff that reduces effects beyond the negligible effects that are already there. We have no objection to this at all. Welcome it, but it needs to be something that's workable, is our view.
So perhaps I can assist. Firstly, the action plan approved pursuant to this condition could only ever come into effect once the planning permission is implemented. That's the nature of conditions. They can't come into effect until a planning permission is implemented. Secondly, I'm afraid my learned friend has misunderstood what is proposed. If you look carefully at what is proposed,
which one are we looking at?
It
Just
doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, okay.
They seek to regulate via a calculation process emissions. There is no process here looking at ground level concentrations, which requires dispersion modelling. That's not what's being done. What is being asked here is that an emissions inventory is drawn up based on what is actually going on as part of the plan, to demonstrate that what they're actually doing achieves the emissions levels that they've already calculated in the ES. So all we're asking is for the same process that's already been done as the input into the dispersion modelling that's been done in the ES is done in the future. So there's no need to concern yourself with the 200 receptors. That's not what is being done here. What is, and Dr. Brimfield will correct me if I get this wrong, I'm sure. So I'm afraid the points about enforceability, the 200 receptors, are misplaced. Dr. Brimfield, have I got that correct? Yes, there we are. That's a relief. All we're asking for is a condition either on the basis that, as we say, policy needs to drive emissions down. There's obviously a disputed principle for you to resolve there. I'm not going to address you on that now. Or on the basis that BALA held to the assessment that they've produced in their environmental statement, which is the second condition, which is obviously from the numbers, the 12 MPPA case that they presented. So that's all it does. It's simply the process of going through the emissions calculations so that they can demonstrate that they've taken action that on calculation hits those targets.
I mean, yeah, I appreciate there's a point in principle that we'll have to deal with. But does it need to be this
I think that
detailed,
it was
specific?
The proportionality of this condition, given the impacts that are identified in the ESA. That's where we're concerned. We think that the Stansted approach would be much more appropriate given the scale of the impacts that we're looking at here. This seems to completely over-egged the situation.
Well, so the Stansted approach does not reflect the submissions that we've made about driving down emissions.
Right.
And so if you adopt that approach, it means you're also already making your decision about that issue. Now, I'm sure you're not intending to betray any such decision at the moment. But that's why we're going beyond. The other aspect of the standstill approach is that it doesn't actually provide any emissions target. We've made submissions about that as well, you'll recall, presented evidence on that. So there are a number of
I understand that, but
solutions.
even if we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it in terms of Dr. Broomfield's submissions on that point. But even if we were to go with Dr. Broomfield on that, it would still not be possible to have a much more simplified condition that talk in generality about achieving some improvement in the future. Would be this great big thing that nobody can really understand apart from probably 2 or 3 people.
Well, I take the point. Again, you're asking for a more simplified version, and we can go away and see what we can produce.
I mean, it would be nice just to have the 2 conditions, very simple form conditions, because ultimately the council has the power to approve what it wants. And so this is why I don't quite understand why there's this trend, not here, just generally, the planning authorities seeking more and more convoluted, complex conditions, trying to put everything in, every conceivable aspect into what a plan should specify. And then at the bottom, it's got to be approved, in writing, so...
Yes, that's true, but of course, approval of a condition can't detract from the principle of the development that's approved. And so that there is an important element of actually identifying whether there is a particular target to achieve or not. So that aspect, I think, is something that needs to be removed. But I take the point about complexity and simplicity, and we'll go away and look at it.
Yes, have an either or depending which way we decide to...
It may be here that there is some, middle way for discussion. Clearly, the objective of an air quality action plan is to improve the situation, to reduce emissions, as against the position where there is no action plan. Otherwise, it'd be very little point in having the action plan. That's the whole purpose of it. I think what becomes difficult is, which clearly these conditions which talk about having to calculate future baselines and things like that are trying to do, is require absolute reduction. In other words, the development takes place, but there can be no increase at all. And I think a condition that is framed around, look, we need to have an action plan that seeks to reduce emissions, not against some artificial future baseline, but just against what would otherwise happen. That might be a way forward, because clearly that would be the purpose of taking the actions in the action plan. So perhaps if we take that away, maybe the council can ponder that.
Mr. Pearce, do you want to say anything on that before we move on?
Not very much. Perhaps if I had an observation, it would be that coming as a modeler primarily, a number cruncher, I would have some concerns about the practicality of even Dr. Broomfield's second proposed condition, the alternative B, in terms of how it would actually be delivered in practical terms. But perhaps it's not worth going into that now.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Huh? Yeah, I think so. Anybody got anything else on that condition?
No, thank you.
Should we move on then? Is it 19 then next?
I think it's 18,
18.
Oh, we missed
the
one.
ATM
18.
condition.
Okay, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm just reading this now that the council's agreed to
That's
adjust
to change
that
the
adjustment.
yes, it's to change the 75,500 to 85,990, which is the figure that comes from the ESA, and indeed is also referred to in, I think, Mr. Williams's proof too. So that includes the general aviation movements as well as the commercial flights.
Mr. Morehouse, have you noted that adjustment?
Yes, we have noted the difference. You will have seen, I think, the observations about, I think, a slightly lower starting point, and that is based on the original application made by the airport. That's in Mr. Melling's proof of evidence, paragraph 3.4.25. We clearly will be advancing that obviously the frequency and number of flights overall is the significant feature to be considered here, because that is what creates the noise impact on those people living nearby. And so we would say all positioning movements, as well as anything else, should be included in that sum.
Ms. Dumfries, does that adjustment give your team some degree of comfort?
Can I just add one more point to that?
Oh, right.
Sorry. We would argue that those figures ought to be separate as well, so that the positioning and general aviation figure of 10,000 is separated from the commercial flights. And that's a way of providing, I think, a better control over what in fact is taking place at the airport.
So split the numbers.
Yes. So we would submit the numbers should be 75,360 as was made in the airport's application, and then an additional 10,000 for positioning and other transport flights.
On that specific
Can I
point.
just add, why we'd like them split is at the moment the operations monitoring report records movements and it actually splits them, and it's a way the parishes who sit on there understand that and can see it, and so to have just suddenly one movement put together would be rather strange.
Okay, helpful. Any comments on that suggestion first, and then maybe more generally on where your team is now on that condition, Mr. Dumfries?
Yes, the noise from a positioning movement doesn't make any difference to the noise from another movement. It's a movement, and therefore, for noise purposes, that's a distinction without a difference. They're reported in that way because so that the airport consultative committee can have the maximum information. We're trying to be transparent. Our position generally on the ATM limit is that this is not necessary. So in terms of the 6 tests for conditions, that this is not necessary. I'll just say 2 or 3 things about that. Firstly, the objective here is to control noise, and as the CAA report, I think it's CD 17, CAP 1731, makes clear the recommended way of controlling noise is through a noise contour cap. It's not right to say that the LAQ contours do not reflect frequency. Of course they reflect frequency. How else could you produce a contour unless you put into it the type and number of aircraft? Of course it reflects frequency, and without going into it, as the social surveys, as we explain, test, they look at people with in different areas, different distances from airports, airports that are busier, less busy, those things, to create the correlation between community response and those LAQ contour. So it obviously does reflect frequency. What CAP 1731, which just for your note is CD 1013, makes clear, we looked at it, is that the recommended approach is a contour cap, and as it makes very clear that there's a much looser correlation with ATM caps and passenger caps. Now, you may say in that case, well, why is there a passenger cap? There are very good reasons why there would be a passenger cap, and many of those are to do with surface access. It's not actually air noise, it's numbers of people coming to the airport. The next point that's kind of made is, well, hey, look at, you know, Heathrow and London City and Stansted. Well, let's look at those. Heathrow has an ATM cap, but it does not have a passenger cap, and therefore it's not it's not a belt and braces in that, and for very good reasons we have here a passenger cap. Stansted, the recent permission, is building on the permission that was granted for what was called the G1, Generation 1 project, which was granted planning permission in October 2008. And that permission had two conditions, ATM 1 and ATM 2, that broadly correspond to the current Stansted condition. In other words, the current Stansted condition wasn't a newly introduced thing. The numbers new, but the concept of an ATM cap wasn't new. It's a roll forward of the previous conditions. We'll come back to that and explain why that's important in a moment. London City Airport is a July 2016 decision. Again, an urban airport, and both noise cap and ATMs. Both of those decisions, the original Stansted from 2008, which has been rolled forward, and London City Airport, sometimes called CADAP, the City Airport development project, both of them predate CAP 1731. CAP 1731, first edition, came out in December 2018. In other words, at the time the original Stansted G1 permission was given, 2008, and at the time that City Airport was given, 2016, the CAA had not given its advice on appropriate ways to control. Now, we do now have, the version we have of CAP 1731 is the second edition, but I don't think it materially changed. We do now have that. That is now the appropriate guidance. And in that context, our view is that if one wants to control air noise, one should impose a condition that relates to air noise. And the most appropriate condition that relates to that is the contour cap. Now, implicit in that is it possible that the numbers of ATMs go slightly beyond those assessed? It is possible, but they could only do that if the aircraft were quieter. And one of the things that we've looked at a lot with N70s and N60s, number above, is in effect noisiness of individual aircraft events. If aircraft got quieter, then those numbers, insofar as people find them useful as a supplementary metric, would be expected to fall. And one of the important things to bear in mind with all of these conditions is what they're doing in a way is they're seeking to drive behavior. We're seeking to use them to drive behavior, not just for the airport, but to help the airport drive behavior with the airlines. And if we are able to a drive behavior where airlines use quieter aircraft that would be slightly smaller. I had the debate with Mr. Fumicelli about whether they'd be half the size. No, that's not plausible. And we've got an ATM, we've got a passenger cap that's just not plausible that they'd be half the size and twice as many of them. But if they, you know, if there's a type of aircraft that comes along that is slightly smaller but is quiet, and therefore we keep within our contour cap, surely there is benefit, we would say, in trying to produce those quietest types of aircraft, and therefore having a tight ATM cap paradoxically has the reverse effect. There's no incentive for airlines to bring their quietest aircraft to Bristol because there's no gain for them. They might as well just stick it at what they've got, which is what we've assessed in the fleet mix. So we think not only is there not a very good reason for an ATM cap, but there are actually very good reasons why it would be appropriate not to have an ATM cap if one's concerned about trying to improve noise environment.
Let me go to Mr. Morehouse. Just from PCAA's point of view, I know you're a big advocate of having this cap on the number of movement. In light of what Mr. Humphreys said there, does that change your position? Is there just some sort of mistrust, you think, of people don't quite understand the noise contour? It's a more nebulous sort of concept, whereas sort of local people understand the sort of the ATM cap and have more comfort with that than something perhaps that's a little bit more, you know, a bit more technical, a bit difficult to understand. Is there anything in that?
Well, I think the nuances of the cap are understood, and the arguments about trying to drive or encourage the driving down of air noise. I make a number of observations in relation to that. I think this harks back in part to the initial discussion that was being had this morning about whether or not the airport is designated, because there aren't, in fact, the sorts of controls that are being suggested in being at the moment. And so, in part, what is being suggested we would submit isn't workable being submitted by the airport. We do say that this application is about intensification of use of the airport, and as we were seeking to establish in cross-examination of Mr. Williams, because the runway can't be expanded, the intensification of use has to work through in the form of additional air movements, either increased concentration of them or an expansion of the time of those, which are, as individual air movements, significant for those people living nearby, and the frequency and the intensity of use is there. And I have to address my learned friend Mr. Humphrey's suggestion that there may at some speculative future point be these small, quieter aircraft. We've seen the modelling of the sorts of aircraft, and we know that are going to be used, and they're advanced by the airport, not some fictitious future aircraft. We know what is being proposed, and we know the impact of those 70, 80 plus decibels on takeoff to those people living nearby per event rather than anything else. And so there really is a significance we maintain in the number of air traffic movements because of the type of airport this is, because of the proximity of people living near to it, and because of the huge degree of intensification around it. And we do think that is, whilst the contours have a value, without recognizing the volume of traffic, it doesn't properly reflect the impact on people.
And what about that specific point Mr. Humphreys raised about if you have the cap, that potentially disincentivises the airline to bring in their quieter planes. In effect, you may be shooting yourself in the foot.
I don't fully understand that, because there's no reason why the cap ought not to apply as an incentive to do that in any event. What this does is it takes the airport, the applicant's own figures that they've advanced, and we would submit both are valid conditions and necessary conditions. What we're doing is taking the airport's figures that they're advancing. If there is nothing to stop the airport, for example, in 10 years' time, if there's some breakthrough in aviation, and that completely changes the situation in making an application to vary the condition, and I'm sure that would be supported. But what we're dealing with in this application, with the forecasts that are put forward, we would submit both are relevant.
So I would just say to maybe help Mr. Morehouse.
1 second.
Oh, I'm
Let the
so
lady
sorry.
back,
I'm
and then
so sorry.
I'll come to you.
I didn't
Then
say
I'll
that.
come to you, and then I'm going to go to Mr. Fumicelli and Mr. Williams, see what they want to say.
Mr. Humphreys just actually said that they could go over the numbers
Yes.
because a quieter aircraft could come in rather than a noisier one. But we have to remember that the quieter ones are still noisy. They're still an event, and they're taking away any of our tranquility that's left. We are fighting just for a few minutes each day without an aircraft movement overhead. So we want to know that we have an exact number every year and no more, not one more event, because we hear that event during the day or at night. That's all I want to say.
Just to clarify, in case Mr. Morehouse wants to come back on it, I wasn't meaning to suggest some entirely new aircraft type, but you will know in the fleet mixes, both ours and indeed Mr. Foley's, there's a sort of a range of different aircraft types. By 2030, predominantly the newer type, the newer generation of aircraft, but some of the older. You remember at one point I took you to a series of contour plans, and we looked at some SEL contour plans. I think it was the 90 SEL contour plans, and I took you to the ones for the Boeing 737 MAX, and you could compare with the existing Boeing 737, and you saw the contour was, my language, quite appreciably smaller. Now, in a sense, if we look at the fleet mixes for 2030, there will be some of the Boeing 737s that are not MAXes. In an ideal world, one would want to incentivize more MAXes, but if the airline is told, right, we're up against the ATM cap, you can't have any more movements, there's no incentive for them if they have MAXes in their fleet and are operating them elsewhere. There's no incentive for them to bring more of them to Bristol Airport. If, on the other hand, they think, actually, if we substitute some of our older aircraft for these newer ones, we can get a few more movements. And it can't realistically be huge numbers of new movements because we have a passenger cap. I'm not going to fly them half full. They're similar aircraft. But that, you know, it seems to us that that is a useful tool in, as I put it, trying to incentivize airlines to use quieter aircraft because they might be able to get a few additional movements, but have to stay within the contour cap. There's no question of them going beyond the contour cap. So that was the point I was making. And I wasn't meaning to imply some breakthrough in aircraft types, just the stuff we've got.
Yeah. So if I understand, so you could have, if the cap, numerical cap, was 100 movements a day. I know it's not that, but just go with this. If it was 100 a day, if they were using the MAXes, with the contour, they could potentially go to 105 a day, but it would then mean that a greater proportion of the 100 that was permitted is then quieter than it would otherwise be.
Correct, because you're staying within the contour cap. The total sound energy is capped, but when you look at your individual movements, you're getting more of the quiet ones. The quieter ones are in effect they're not in addition to the noisy ones, they're replacing the older types, otherwise you wouldn't stay within the cap. If you just simply added them, on top of what you had before, you'd have a bigger contour. You're not. You're encouraging airlines, you're incentivizing them, and it seems to us that that's worthwhile. And together with a passenger cap, that means that in reality the number of ATMs can't double or do anything like that, because the aircraft would have to be really, really small, and it's just not plausible. But the sort of change yes, it seems to us that there's merit in that. It drives an overall reduction.
May I just respond just to that one point, and it follows up Mrs. Byrne's observations. A good example of this, and obviously it can be seen of a new type aircraft, can be seen in inquiry document 2.20.4, which looks at, for example, the air contours created by an Airbus A321 NEO, the new quieter aircraft. And the significance, and no one's arguing that these aircraft aren't quieter than the preceding aircraft, but the contours shown in this are reflective of 80 decibels LMAX levels. And that, even though it's quieter than the preceding ones, that contour of 80 decibels doesn't clearly reflect the lower levels, which are still, from the recipient's point of view, extremely high and sufficient to be completely disruptive of ordinary life that exists outside of that. So whilst everyone welcomes quieter aircraft, and obviously the fringes of those contours for individual aircraft, it will probably get slightly better. But for most people living under the immediate flight path of these things, it makes very little difference, and it is that frequency and intensity of flight which is a very, very significant feature.
Mr. Taylor.
Sir, thank you. So the only reason to resist an ATM's limit is to be able to fly more planes than has been assessed in the environmental statement and the environmental statement addendum. The upshot of that is that there is potential for more frequency of overflight. The LAEQ index, as we've heard Mr. Fiumicelli, I'm sure will explain this better than I can, is relatively insensitive to changes in number. But the N60 and N70 indexes that we've spent so much time looking at would show changes. What we don't know, because it's not been assessed, is how significant those changes would be, and how frequently, how much more frequently, those living in the environment around the airport would be impacted by movements above, reaching 70 or reaching 60 at night. And so, because the LAQ is insensitive, without an ATM's limit, you have no control over the number of events. And so that is why an ATM's limit is proposed. And indeed, that is why an ATM's limit is used at other airports. And we have, in the recent Stansted decision, an airport which is regulated by a contour cap, by passenger throughput, and by ATM's limit in conditions 7, 8, and 9 in that decision. Now, if it's necessary at Stansted, it is difficult to see any reason why it is not necessary at Bristol. The third element I wanted to address you on is this new argument that we've been presented with this morning, for which there is no evidential basis, that somehow an ATM's limit will discourage the use of quieter aircraft. that argument, with the greatest of respect, is fallacious. The contour, take a situation where there is no ATMs limit. The contour cap means that the fleet has to fly aircraft in a proportion of quieter aircraft to the current generation of aircraft of the order that Mr. Brass has identified in order to reach the ATMs that we're talking about. So if the ATMs increase by reference to older aircraft, you have to have, if the proportion of older aircraft increases, compared to what Mr. Brass has assumed, the number of flights has to reduce to stay within the contour cap. Now, in that situation, we would have an airport with a capacity of throughput for passengers that it wouldn't be attaining. And so there's a commercial onus on airlines, a commercial benefit to switch to the quieter aircraft, because they can then take up the additional ATMs within the contour cap. And so actually the whole point here is that there is no disincentive by applying an ATMs limit, because the situation will be effectively the same. The contour is the contour cap that provides that onus. Quite apart from the fact that there's absolutely no evidence to support my learned friend's submissions. Mr. Brass didn't suggest, for example, that the only way to get to his fleet mix for 2030 for 12 MPPA was without an ATMs limit, because that would disincentivise the switch to quieter aircraft. There's just no evidence on it. So those are the submissions that I have. I think Mr. Fumicelli might be able to assist you a bit further.
Mr. Fumicelli, you've been sat there listening
Yeah,
patiently.
thank you, sir. Actually, I think most of what I was going to say has been said, so I won't repeat it, except for the point in relation to the Stansted decision. It's a clear example of recognition that the LEQ metric, which is the basis for the noise contours, has limitations. There's no ideal metric that will cover off every single effect in every single way, and I discussed that in my evidence. And it demonstrates how you need a matrix of conditions which cover different elements to be able to control things. And in my view, an ATM cap is required along with a limit on the contour areas, as well as passenger throughput. A quick point about aircraft getting less noisy. Yes, that's true. And just make the point, and this is borne out by the, I forget the CD reference number, it's the SONA 2014 dose response study. And it shows that although aircraft have got significantly, substantially less noisy in the last 40 years, the proportion of the population that reports being highly annoyed at any particular aircraft noise level has increased. And it's the exact reasons why aren't sure, but in the same period, the number of ATMs has increased dramatically. It's more than doubled at Heathrow, for example. There's a link. The exact precision of that link is yet to be fully established, but I think we need to be careful about aircraft getting marginally less noisy and that actually being noticed and valued by people. Again, my evidence talks about that in some detail. I'll stop there, sir, if that's okay. Thank you.
If I might just come back. So again, it's important not to mischaracterize this point. I'm not saying the lack of an ATM cap is required to get to Mr. Brass's fleet mix or the contours in 2030. Those are the contours. But what I'm saying is, what happens when you get to 2030? You're at 2030, you have Mr. Brass's fleet mix, the contour is as predicted. Think of an individual airline. It happens to be flying some of the older aircraft. What incentive is there for it to move to Bristol quieter aircraft? Absolutely none. It's within the cap and it's not allowed any more movements. It's at that point. It's not that you need this to get to the contours, or it's what do you do with on? If you have an ATM cap, you remove any incentive for an airline above what it was otherwise going to do. You remove any incentive for it to continue to bring quieter aircraft, and you know, for communities, we do think that's useful, that would bring benefit. Now, you know, others may say no, we don't want that type of benefit, but that's not the only, but that's one of the reasons why we think this is not appropriate. As I say, we also think it's not appropriate because it doesn't control noise, and I've gone through those points, but this was just a sub-point about what happens beyond 2030.
Mr. Humphreys, what about the Stansted point, though? So we've got conditions 7, 8 and 9 on...
Yes, they have. I made the point. I looked this morning at the 2008 Stansted decision, and I should put my hand up. I was counsel for Stansted. But that's why I have the data, and that was a condition imposed in 2008. I can't pretend instantly that I remember all the debates about that way too long ago, but there wasn't at that point cap 1731. There wasn't this clear advice that that type of condition is appropriate. As I have said, passenger caps are typically imposed not for air noise reasons, they're typically imposed actually for surface access reasons, numbers of people on the roads or rail or whatever. They have a consequential effect, it so happens, of then indirectly affecting the number of ATMs, because if you had that cap, unless you halved the size of the aircraft, you couldn't number the size. But that's, in a sense, coincidental. The purpose is to control numbers of people. Back then in 2008, that cap advice wasn't there, and that condition was imposed. I think the point I was making is, in that context, it's perhaps not surprising that the condition has simply been rolled forward. But there is no such equivalent condition here. The airport has operated in the way it has, with a contour cap for many, many years, and without an ATM cap.
So can I just come back on one small point? And it's about the new point that's been raised about disincentivization beyond 2030.
Yeah.
Of course, at 2030, on Bow's own case, what it's seeking is a contour cap and a passenger limit. And so to go, remember the ATM's limit's being resisted so you can fly more planes. So at 2030, we've reached 12 MPPA, we're within the contour, and they want to fly more aircraft. Well, they'll fly more aircraft only if they breach the passenger limit. So this incentivization point doesn't work. It simply doesn't work, because at that point, they will have to apply for another permission if they want to go beyond 12 MPPA. And at that point, they would be able to also review any ATM's limit that were imposed now. So it's as straightforward as that.
I don't want to keep playing table tennis with it, but...
Mr. Williams has got his hand up.
Do you want to have a...
Mr. Williams has got his hand up.
Miss Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you. Firstly, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. I think there's been a few points made about essentially saying that it's not relevant because you couldn't breach your number of movements without breaching a different condition. And I think for me that's kind of the point, is that the condition isn't necessary, because in most circumstances you would be breaching a different condition if you had more flights. For example, if obviously previously we had discussions about fleet mix. If the fleet mix is noisier, you'd breach your contour cap without reaching that number of flights. I think the reason, the points about incentivization of new aircraft would be essentially if the aircraft has not been optimistic, sorry, the airport has been not optimistic enough in terms of its future fleet mix, and airlines are in a position to have more of the newer flights than they had currently estimated, in which case potentially the movement limit might be the constraining factor, and in that case there would be essentially a disincentivization to bring those new aircraft to Bristol. Obviously this is a relatively unlikely case, but I think it's the only case where a movement limit would actually be relevant. And so I think it's a material consideration against having one.
Thank you. Anybody else want to say anything on this? Because I'm going to take a very short break, and then we'll come back and move on. But yes.
Could I make just a very quick statement? Just listening to those arguments, Lawrence Vaughan with PCAA for noise. You weren't here last week when I gave evidence in person, but anyway, I think probably the other thing that we haven't talked about is you can count the number of aircraft, whereas it's very hard to measure LAEQ. So when you're talking about what has happened, you can say how many flights were there. And I think as we discussed, a lot of the LAEQ contours are about future predictions. I know there might be some conditions now to do some historical consideration of that. But I think as having an aircraft movement limit is an easily enforced condition. Simple as that.
Okay.
That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Should come back at 15 minutes. Yeah, should we come back at 25 past? Yeah, the inquiry is adjourned. Okay, 25 past, the inquiry is resumed. Right. Condition 19. I'm just reading then, there's been some progress on this condition. Not right, Mr. Taylor? Yes.
Can you turn your microphone?
Touche. Sorry, sir. I'm just catching up with where we are. I think it's condition 19, isn't it?
Yes, so does the council agree to agree that the contour should reflect those identified and assessed in the ES?
Yes.
This is this issue of size, isn't it, that we heard about?
That came up, didn't it?
Yeah.
It did come up in the evidence, yes. I think Val are seeking some flexibility, but we wish to hold them to what's been assessed. And indeed, we'd have concerns about the legality of anything else.
Yeah. Mr. Fumicelli, have you been involved in discussions on this?
I have, sir, and yeah, and my view is that if we're going to set a noise contour, it needs to be a noise contour whose likely significant effects have been assessed. Now, if it's almost as if a sort of Rochdale envelope approach could be taken, where you present some reasonable worst case. I mean, if the 11.5 kilometre squared that the airport's asking for as the contour size in the excuse me, excuse me.
Call an ambulance.
No, it's just a piece of toast went the wrong way. Sorry. Right, start again. The airport asking for a marginally, well, not marginally, a larger contour than has been assessed and presented in the AS and the X, and I just think there's a fundamental problem with that. The decision maker hasn't been presented with an assessment of the possible potential or actual likely significant effects of what's being asked for. I just think that grinds up against the EIA core principles in many respects. I'm sure Mr. Taylor can expand upon the law of that better than I can. You're being asked to agree something or prove something that we haven't been presented with any form of assessment of its potential impacts.
Mr. Williams? Anything you want to add, Mr. Williams?
I think just on the point that we've not assessed it in any way. Obviously, we did do a high-level assessment of the faster growth scenario and indicated it would be around 10% larger, which is, I think, 11.7, but the same sort of ballpark. Essentially, 11.5 is what was previously agreed with the council on the basis it was still an improvement over the current permission. So it's not that there's some kind of undefined, unlimited effects. There would still be improvement over what's currently permitted. But as far as I know, the airport and the council are considering whether they can meet on this, or whether the airport are considering whether they can meet the council on this. But it's clearly not been resolved yet.
Mr. Humphreys, do you want to add anything on to that?
Yes, there are a number of different and interrelated points here. One, you will notice one of the differences between the parties on the contour cap is not just the size of the contour, but which contour. So the contours in the past have been the 57 dB contour daytime, and 57 was always chosen for airport contours because it reflected the onset of significant community annoyance. That was the old pre-sonar level. Sonar changed that to 54. Now, just on
which contour, there is some logic in staying at 57 simply because then one can sort of be consistent with the approach that has been taken in the past. In a sense, the point with all these contours is, you know, like a land contour. I mean, the hill is a certain size. You can measure it here, you can measure it here, or you can measure it here. It's exactly the same hill. It's just the level at which you measure it. So with measuring it at 57, there's some logic in doing that. I think, you know, we can see that there could equally be logic in doing it at 54, as that's the current onset of significant community annoyance, and that's what Stansted did. They will have moved to that, and you know, there's a space for discussion, I think, there. There's then the discussion about the size of the contour. Let's just, for the moment, stick with the size of 57 contours, just because I, for one, am more familiar with those, and the previous permission talks in 57 terms, but you know, there's an equivalent, obviously, at the other contour levels. The existing permission, which, if this current appeal was unsuccessful, would apply, is a contour cap of 12.42 square kilometres at the 57 contour level. What the council are seeking, and I specifically asked Mr. Fumicelli this, what the council is seeking is that the 2030 contour is as assessed in the ES, which at the 57 level is 10.7 kilometres. Now that is slap bang tight around what we have forecast there, but I think the airport is willing to discuss with the council setting a 2030 limit at that level, which is tight and assumes, you know, over time that the aircraft types have moved to the new types. But what it would need to do that is then something that reflects the position that its existing contour is 12.42, and it needs to be allowed to kind of move down to that lower contour. I think if we can agree that basis, that we're setting a contour at 2030 based around the ES figure for 2030, then, you know, I think we'd like to discuss it with the council, but I think there's prospect there that we could agree that. But as I say, I think the challenge for us would be the interim period where it's more difficult to predict exactly what the contour sizes would be. The existing contour is much bigger, and we would want that ability to move down to the tighter contour. But within those parameters, I think there's room for some real discussion.
Okay. So, if I may, the position as we see it is that the attempt to have a larger contour as at 2030 is one which would render any permission granted unlawful. It would allow likely significant impacts beyond those which have been assessed in the ES, and the Rochdale approach applies as Mr. Fumicelli's explained. In terms of using the existing contour as a reference point, we say that's completely misconceived because, as Mr. Williams confirmed in cross-examination questions from me, he agreed that there was no real prospect of that contour ever being attained if planning permission is refused for the proposed scheme. So there is no fallback against that permission. It's just there's no evidence that it would ever be attainable because you hit up against the 10 MPPA passenger throughput restriction before you get there. In terms of transition from the current position to 2030, I take my learned friend's point. We're happy to go away and discuss that further. However, the evidence that you have before you, I believe, shows in Mr. Williams's proof is the same contour size at 2024 as it does at 2030 in the without case from memory. But we'll look at that. I could be wrong on that. And we're happy to go and discuss it further.
I mean, that's obviously very helpful. I think it's this sort of interim stage that is most difficult for the airport. Clearly the short-term consequences, but also the bounce back from the pandemic, as you know, we've all made very clear, makes it extremely difficult for us to quite understand how markets will operate. Obviously, the forecasts did their best to look at, you know, an interim year of 2024 in a 10 MPPA case, but you know, it's very difficult, frankly, to just know if that's accurate. And it is in that context that obviously the arrival of Jet 2 perhaps makes some difference, because our expectation on Jet 2 is, which is why we're content to discuss the 10.7 contour in 2030, is that Jet 2 will have to change its fleet. You know, it will have to modernize, and the contour sets that expectation that they will do that, and we're very happy to discuss that and if appropriate be bound to that. But what happens in the very short term is just extremely difficult for us to forecast. And as I say, you know, up to at the moment, up until we get to 12 million, we have the existing cap, which I should say it's not just a theoretical figure, it's what the council considered was appropriate and acceptable when they imposed it. So, you know, I think there's some room for real discussion there. That also needs, I think, to be, you know, an acceptance of, you know, of the realities and the difficulties for the airport in a post-pandemic situation of trying to, frankly, recover. But I think there's space there for us to come up with something that could be acceptable to both parties. I hope so.
Is the council alive to that real difficulty there that Mr. Humphrey mentions?
Yes, well, you'll recall in our forecasting evidence we raised all sorts of concerns about uncertainties in the future relating to these sorts of issues. So what Mr. Humphreys has said is a welcome confirmation of what we understood the position to be.
Well, this, you know, this is a sort of slightly cheap shot. What we have said is, of course, there are uncertainties, but we would be, you know, I'm indicating, I'm trying to meet, we're indicating a willingness to have a cap based on our 2030 contour. I'm trying, you know, I'm trying to express the reality that I'm acting for an airport that is recovering from, you know, a pretty extraordinary shock that is trying to rebuild, and that makes it in the short term for us, the next few years, very difficult to predict exactly what numbers there are in the short term, exactly what the fleet mix is, exactly what the contour size. But the objective that we've all talked about, and I've talked about with Mr. Fumicelli, is getting to that 12 MPPA case. I mean, it doesn't have to be 2030, but when we get to 12 MPPA, that we will
Yes.
Discuss that contour.
So there's no major distance between you on the bookends, if you like. It's the in-between and getting the flexibility built in
That's
between.
a nice way of putting it.
It only becomes an issue once the airport hits 10 MPPA, because up to that point it can operate under its existing consent. So we're talking about having a discussion about how we go from 10 MPPA to 12 MPPA.
Yeah.
I'm happy to have that discussion. It seems to me that that's more likely to happen further in the future, so it's potentially less impacted by the issue that Mr. Humphreys is talking about, potentially. But we'll look at it and we'll see what we can come up with.
Excellent. Okay, anything else on that?
No, I think it's just a case of knocking heads together and having
Yeah.
a chat. And we don't need to sort of necessarily go into the whys and why nots at this point. And we can pick up anything when we do the condition session again.
Do we need to spend any time on 20? Because I see
Don't.
says it's agreed now, subject to the Grampian condition
You
issue.
don't need to from my perspective.
I didn't.
No, that's the, I think in effect the reporting condition, isn't it? No, I think that is agreed.
Then
21 is that agreed as well?
It is subject to the typo being
Yeah.
corrected, which you'll have seen further down. I think we originally had a quota count of 1 or above, and it should have been 2 or above.
I mean, my only point about that one is it's another very lengthy condition. If there's any streamlining.
Yes, I think quota count conditions often are, because you're sort of you're trying to create an entire regime. Now, could you kind of outsource it and say, look, the quota count will be as in accordance with document X and it all goes into X? You could, but it's maybe it's slightly less transparent for someone looking at it. So it's not unusual to have a longer one. I'm sure we can look at the language, but they typically are quite long, I'm afraid.
They are. I'm afraid that's just the nature of the beast.
No, and that's fine. If it needs to be long, it needs to be long. I think where we can make things simpler, then that's good. But
I think it'll be much shorter actually when we have wider columns.
Well, yes.
and maybe shorter, smaller type. We could work on that, I suppose.
Excuse me, may I just, on that particular condition, I think there's a contradiction
Okay.
between the table and the text immediately after it. So the table says that aircraft below 80 EPNDB have a quota count, but the text immediately below it says there are exempt aircraft.
Okay.
But I think the table is implying there are no exempt aircraft.
Don't know if anyone can clarify.
Can we, Mr. Vaughan, it sounds like an interesting point, and if there is an inconsistency, we need to iron it out, rather than sort of all trying to do it in,
No,
in
absolutely. I just wanted
plenary
to
session. You raise a
I can
perfect...
probably help. I think that was something that myself and Ms. Fumicelli had discussed at a previous meeting, and I think it just looks like it's not got followed through. We had noticed that, and it's not got picked up in this version, should we say?
There are, Mr. Vaughan, you
Big
tick. Well done. I think it's been identified and it just hasn't found its way into the text, but thank you.
All right.
So 22.
22.
PCAA.
And then PCAA of what I'm looking at. You disagree with that, saying there should be a reduction in the summer nighttime movement limit of aircraft movements. The winter and summer season should not become a rolling annual limit. The airport don't have any comments, and nor do the council. Mr. Taylor, do you want to take on perhaps PCAA's comments, or should Mr. Morehouse, do you want?
I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to do so.
I think Mrs. Byrne was just going to make some observations about the rationale behind the PCAA position.
It's rather like I said when I was on the witness stand. We know that these flights, the winter flights, are going to be moved into the busy timetable. There's going to be many more flights at night during the summer months. And this is dire, it's shocking, it's unacceptable. And one of the things that residents have said over and over again, they simply do not want any more night flights. So to actually increase the summer nights is unacceptable to us. So we simply do not accept the rolling annual total. I mean, we can look at this in a historical context. I mean, this, I think, condition came in 2000. It was in the last one. As we get to the limit, it has become unacceptable at night. And so the condition does meet the criteria of a condition. In fact, that you know, it's stopping the adverse impacts of airport noise at night getting worse. It's definitely relevant, and it's definitely necessary.
Mr. Humphreys, I assume you will say that a reduction in the nighttime limits would be sort of contrary to what's being applied for itself, would it? So
yes, I mean, that was the very first point I was going to make. I mean, this is one of the things we have applied for, and I suppose there are three further things. One, the assessment has been carried out on the basis that of this amendment to a condition which is agreed with the council. Secondly, obviously, we have tightened the QC condition to force quieter aircraft, and third, we have imposed a new air noise contour, again relating to the night period. So our view is that this is an appropriate condition. I accept, of course, as Ben has turned out, that this is one of the things that creates an impact of the development. There's, you know, one can see it. We've discussed it, and that is one of the things that has to be taken into account in the overall planning balance. You know, that's our position on that.
Ms. Byrne, one of the conditions, one of the rules, if you like, of the government sets, or the law sets out in terms of conditions, is you can't have a condition that changes the nature of the development that's been applied for. So if somebody applies for 100 houses, you can't then put a condition on that says no, you know, no more than 80. And that's sort of a simple example. So I think that was the point being made there, that sort of if you had a condition like that, then it would, you know, they wouldn't be able to implement the development that they've applied for. Anybody else?
I think there is inevitably, as you've identified, a concern which, as you probably identify, as a matter of law, people's personal experiences are obviously something very different to that and their concerns, and I hope you understand where that is motivated from.
Anything else on that one? Did you want to say anything, Mr. Taylor, or on that?
No, sir, thank you very much.
All right.
I mean, it's obviously something we're going to be considering as a point of principle, rather than, and you know, we've heard the evidence in terms of the points of view of the PCAA and the airport, so we'll grapple with that.
I mean, it has been a long-standing condition, which is actually protecting the residents, and I can't say that any more strongly. And really, to take that away is exceptionally harmful, and people will be waking up more than once or twice, because they do not come in as a clump. They do come in regularly through the night, and I think I've given evidence on that.
Okay. I think pretty much the same set of comments and responses probably apply to the next condition. So unless anybody's got any further to add, we can move on to ground noise, condition 24. this is just an issue in terms of hours, is it? Or
Yes, it's an argument about whether the condition should extend for the full night period, in other words, from 11 o'clock till 7 a.m., which is the council's position,
Yeah.
or to 6 a.m., which is Bal's position.
It's a straightforward
yeah.
disagreement about the hour. The assessment we've carried out, that you'll have seen in our evidence, including in Mr. Williams' evidence, I think there was section 5.6 of his rebuttal, explains our position on this. That there aren't likely significant effects of the hour being 6 rather than 7, and therefore, that's our position. Again, you'll judge it on the evidence.
Okay. Well, it's probably something we're going to have a look at on the site visit, and we'll have a listen on the site visit. Mr. Morehouse.
Just to make the PCAA's position clear on this, we would invite you to say that there should not be any auxiliary power units on those two stands at all. We'd also like to I know this is probably going to be dealt with in other conditions, but just to raise the concern again about the use of permitted development rights to build on green belt areas, these sorts of areas which has been done historically, we think, unlawfully, but not enforced, it seems, by the local planning authority. But that's another reason why we would like a rejection of the use of APUs at that location. They haven't followed a proper procedure. And secondly, we would invite, to prevent that happening again, the removal of those rights.
Yeah, there were some conditions on the wider list, I think, Mr. Taylor, weren't there, about removal of certain permitted development rights. I know we sort of provided some initial comments back
Yes.
on that, but we'll probably get to that at
I'm afraid I can't recall the details off the top of my head at the moment.
I think we've... Sorry.
I was just going to say, just on Mr. Morehouse's last point about the permitted development rights, of course it is permitted development, but it is important to note that all permitted development will go through a screening process, EIA screening process with the council, and if necessary be consulted on. So it's not a position that we just kind of do it. We obviously submit it to the council to make sure that they don't think that this is EIA development, and they will negatively screen it and tell us, no, that's fine, you can exercise your permitted development rights. So it is important to just bear that in mind.
Thank you.
If it's my understanding on permitted development rights, you can't place conditions on them. So, however harmful that activity is, a condition can't be placed to protect A, the environment, or B, residents.
Well, I mean, there are certain types of condition that are automatically imposed by the permitted development order and so on. But maybe this is a discussion to have offline. In the sense, those stands are there, so
yes.
that is that. We're now talking about the conditions.
We'll come back to those conditions when we have probably our overarching conditions session towards the end of the inquiry. Incidentally, do we know where we're at with that? Obviously, we've had a progress, and there'll be more progress with the conditions we've discussed today, but the wider list of conditions, the comments we provided at the feedback, I'm sure there's been meetings and things going on behind the scenes, but do we know when we might get another sort of version of...
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that at the moment. Can I let you know via the programme officer if that's acceptable?
Fine.
I think just a point, just, you know, it's an iterative process. Just we would really encourage all parties to keep at it and keep working together on it.
I know there's a meeting on transport issues coming up, or surface access, whatever you want to call it. So there is discussion occurring on a sort of topic by topic basis. But if you don't mind, I'll try and update you via the programme officer.
Okay. Well, I'm running the highways week. When we come back after the bank holiday, we will probably, looking at the schedule, probably have a bit of time towards the end of that week. That may disappear, but at the moment, we appear to have a little bit of time, so we might do a similar process whilst we've got the highway witnesses with us. So,
it's been helpful for me, certainly, having sat through the noise and air, just to do this now, particularly with the professional witnesses, and it's all being fresh in our minds, so we do thank you.
I think these sorts of conditions are not the sort of conditions that we as inspectors come up against, because you know, you don't do many airport expansions.
No.
There aren't many around, so
they're very specialist, very specialist conditions. I appreciate that.
Okay, has anybody got anything else to add before we...
I've got one thing to add, which is that we have received a reply from the Department for Transport, which we are, if it hasn't been provided to the programme officer yet, it will be winging its way imminently. It's 36 pages, so there's going to be a bit to absorb.
So you're pleased we said Friday, not the Tuesday?
I'm very pleased, yes. It was quite prescient, thank you.
Okay.
Anything else, Dad? I mean, we all know we're doing a site visit week after next. Wednesday and a Thursday.
We've got the itinerary for the self-guided, the Wednesday tour, inspector tour. Thursday we've submitted our requests of where we want to go in the airport.
Yeah. So we need the passes. We need clearance, I think, before we go on that.
Yes, I was just to say, I think one of the things on the site visit you've asked about is the control tower. I think is in effect sort of locked down for obvious reasons. You ping everybody up there, and there's a very big issue. But we're asking the question, we're seeing, so we're sort of making the we're making the inquiries. Presumably that's run by, yeah, it is. I thought so. Yeah, it's obviously run by the National Air Traffic Services, NATS, rather than the airport. But but obviously there's a very strong relationship. But so we're asking the question, and we'll see what happens. We'll let you know.
I think if you can advise on any health and safety things, if we're required to wear masks and lateral flow tests, and also equipment, safety shoes, that kind of thing.
I suspect you might be required on lateral flow tests. I've been required by the client to have one every day of this inquiry. So you might have to do one of those, I'm afraid, but we'll let you know. We'll be putting something through the programme.
Yeah.
So we'll liaise on that.
Okay. Anything else?
All right. Okay. Well, in that case...
End of part one.
Yes. Enjoy your time away from Western,
break.
if you're going away. And we'll see you all in a couple of weeks' time.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. An
Thank
inquiry
you,
is now adjourned.